Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video covers sections 3 to 7 of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. The field of clinical psychology, where I did my formal training, is principally oriented toward evidence-based treatments, abbreviated as EBTs. EBTs serve as a measuring stick for the adequacy or inadequacy of theoretical orientations and the interventions that emerge from them. But what is meant here by evidence? Most often it concerns an outcome that lends itself to being empirically observable and thus measured numerically by some instrument. For clinical psychology, such instruments often entail self-report surveys capable of quantifying changes in symptom severity and so-called daily functioning. I mention this example of evidence not only because it's one I'm intimately familiar with, but it's also because it offers entry into thinking about the general aim of all sciences, which entails a search for evidence that corroborates or disconfirms claims about some given situation. For Husserl, this striving to obtain evidence speaks to a fundamental principle important for establishing a foundation for all knowledge. And yet, I also offer this example because it will help draw a sharper distinction between the narrow conception of evidence being promoted in contemporary psychotherapeutic practice, for example, and Husserl's broadened definition. And so the following will be addressed. 1. We'll first define some terms, including science, idea, judgment, and cognition. 2. We'll ask, what is evidence and what kinds of evidence are there? And 3. In what way does this notion of evidence provided by Husserl offer a methodological principle that can guide the grounding of all science? As beginning philosophers and in seeking to establish an all-embracing science, we must put out of play all accepted convictions and claims that do not meet the criterion of indubitability. This includes, surprisingly enough, the presumption that any such grounded, all-embracing science is even actualizable, or what it would even look like should it even be actualized. This last point is where Descartes went astray, since he presupposed that such a grounding science should be modeled on geometry and mathematics. So how then should we proceed? Although we cannot yet assert what this science would look like or whether it can be actualized, there is a certainty we have with the idea of such a possibility in its indeterminate fluid generality. In other words, we have the idea of the possibility of there being such a grounding science. And this idea of the possibility will be a guiding light in thinking about the possibility itself and whether and how it may be actualized. Now, there are a few terms I should clarify here before we get any further. Whenever Husserl uses the term science, we have to not limit its meaning to what we might typically think of it. Science here does not simply refer to those empirical investigations that entail controlled experimentation and statistical analysis. Instead, Husserl uses the term in a way that relates to its older sense as simply a body of knowledge, which can have many branches, some of which include the natural and social and mathematical sciences, but also the human sciences of history, literature, and philosophy. So what Husserl is after here is a science that embraces and grounds all these other sciences without presuming that any one is a model for the rest of them, and in particular that any one's definition of evidence or claims to evidence overrides the claims of evidence of the other sciences. The next term to mention here is an idea, as when we speak of the idea of science. Here, idea is not simply synonymous with thinking or holding some mental representation, but concerns an ideal of science, its aim and purpose. So when Husserl claims that we know the idea of all science, He is saying that we have access to a general aim or purpose that governs every science, regardless of its particular methods or subject matter. Our next step is to discover how to transform this vague general idea of science into something distinct. One central feature Husserl identifies in the idea of science is that every science seeks out a genuine agreement between judgments and a state of affairs that justifies those judgments. A judgment is a mental act that functions like a proposition, that is, a statement that can be either true or false. Husserl also calls these judgments meanings. A judgment entails giving a meaning to some given situation. In other words, judgments are grounded in the judged, or the meant state of affairs, affair complex, or situation. We might call this the data that supports or disputes a judgment, so long as we're not thinking or limiting data to something numerical. Returning to the example we began this video with, I could make the following judgment, or what might be called here a hypothesis, that the behavioral intervention of systematic desensitization is effective in reducing phobic symptoms. This is a judgment that by itself is an empty statement without some state of affairs or data that may be called upon to verify it. In fact, I chose a rather complex sentence here that contains within it several embedded judgments, some being as basic as there's something called a symptom, something called a phobia, something called systematic desensitization, that is, judgments of being or judgments of existence, as well as that systematic desensitization is a kind of behavioral intervention, which is a judgment of relation. And while this example does illustrate a judgment, it's also a bit too complex for what Husserl will be trying to get at, which is trying to justify the most basic judgments such that one could build upon them these more complex judgments that we find, say, in social sciences. The act of explaining the connection between a judgment and a given state of affairs is what Husserl calls cognition. As such, cognition concerns a connection between the act of thinking, the cogito, and what one thinks about, the cogitatum. And as a little preview for what is to come in later videos, one way Husserl's conception of transcendental subjectivity is distinguished from Descartes' is it's not limited to one of these poles, that is, the ego cogito, but rather transcendental subjectivity has to do with the inextricable link between cogito and cogitatum, between thinking and the thing we're thinking about. So I'm not merely my thinking, but my thinking as it is directed to something thought about. When I behold an agreement or harmonization between a judgment and the state of affairs, this is called evidence. To quote Husserl, evidence is, in an extremely broad sense, an experiencing of something that is a mental seeing of something itself. It is wherein one grasps something in itself with total certainty. Positive evidence is a situation in which the judger comes to behold the state of affairs in themselves in such a manner that fulfills a judgment, providing an evident possessing of correctness for what I previously only meant at a distance from that state of affairs. In contrast, negative evidence entails a conflict between a judgment and what gives itself. The content of such negative evidence is that of an evident falsity. And so we turn again to the social sciences or any other kinds of empirical experimental sciences. This can be equivalent to either supporting the alternative hypothesis, that being the hypothesized experimental outcome, and supporting the null hypothesis, which would be somewhat corresponding to negative evidence, that there is no difference between groups in such a manner that would counteract the alternative hypothesis. Now, when we're talking about evidence, we may be often talking about what's called a perfect evidence. That is, evidence given in a manner that fulfills a judgment or one's meaning intention. In other words, we acquire an evidence that allows us to determine the truth or falsity of some judgment. However, such perfect evidence, as you might imagine, is an idea the scientist strives for, but rarely, if ever, actually achieves. Instead, we often find imperfect evidence and incompleteness, obscurity, and indistinctness of what gives itself in evidence. That is, there is an infectedness of the experience with unfulfilled components, with expectant and attendant meanings. As such, the scientist aims toward an infinite horizon of approximations tending toward that idea through a perfecting whereby further harmonious experiences become fulfilled in actual experience. In other words, science is often a matter of progress rather than perfection. It's one of the reasons why, at least in most practices of science, it would be improper to say how science proves something. Science proves that omega-3 fatty acids reduce the risk of dementia. Such a formulation confers a certainty for what is only a statistical probability. And this leads us to consider another distinction Husserl makes here between pre-predicative judgments and predicative judgments in evidence. That is, the scientific endeavor is not simply about making and verifying judgments, but also expressing those judgments and verifications. And this expression has its own kind of evidence. To return to our example, we may genuinely behold an evidence that a particular therapeutic intervention is beneficial. However, how I communicate those findings may be inadequate or misleading, as illustrated in the case where one deploys the language of proof for what is merely a probability. So there can be felicitous and infelicitous expressions, or expressions that range in degrees of completeness. This distinction between the pre-predicative and predicative will be a point of contention, I think, for those who come from fields like structural linguistics and hermeneutics, wherein language is thought not simply to represent reality, but actively constructs it in such a manner that no neat divide could ever be achieved between the pre-predicative and the predicative. Some going so far as to suggest that the pre-predicative is merely an error produced by a mistaken use of language. As we'll continue on, we'll have to consider whether this would be a fair critique of Husserl's approach to language, or whether his phenomenology of language is in fact more nuanced than this would suggest. Husserl does not deny that it can at some point become doubtful or show itself as an illusion, such as what happens in the case of optical illusions and sensuous experience. We perhaps all had such a clear sense of evidence for our judgments only to discover that the evidence we behold was somehow misleading. Husserl is also not making any claims here about the correctness of any particular kind of evidence for specific sciences, but is only claiming that intrinsic to the scientific enterprise is a seeking to realize itself in this manner. The scientist does not merely seek to make specific claims, but is always seeking to ground those claims, or stated another way, they do not try to claim any kind of knowledge unless it can be justified in the act of grounding that can be freely repeated with the same results. And again, I have to emphasize that this does not necessarily mean evidence and results in the same manner as the natural sciences would think of it. And from this description, Husserl derives a first methodological principle, that no judgment must be accepted as scientific that has not been derived from evidence, from experiences in which the affairs and affair complexes in question are present to me as they themselves. This description of the idea of genuine science as the seeking for perfect evidence still leaves us with the question as to how we can concretely implement such an enterprise to make it practically possible when we must have access to a kind of evidence that gets us started in the right direction, so to speak. That is, a kind of evidence that precedes the search for any other kind of evidence. But how would this be possible if, as beginning philosophers, we have rendered ourselves completely destitute of all scientific knowledge? What this demands is a kind of perfect evidence called apodicticity, which is unlike the kind of evidence we've been previously discussing. Those kinds of evidence are only certain about a state of affairs, but it remains conceivable that doubt could enter at some point. In contrast, apodictic evidence is characterized by the inconceivability of this possibility that such doubt could ever enter in. Returning to Descartes' own meditations here, we can begin to understand what this means. For Descartes, the existence of the material world presented itself to him in full and certain evidence. And yet, he could imagine a situation in which doubt entered, wherein he could be mistaken about such a judgment concerning the existence of the material world. Consequently, this certainty held toward the existence of the material world, though appearing in full evidence, is not necessarily certain. In other words, we could say that what we have here is a contingent certainty. That is, a certainty that is predicated upon another kind of evidence that itself can be doubted. And so, in establishing a beginning philosophy, the task is now to discover whether it is possible for there to be a kind of evidence that precedes and is the basis for all other kinds of evidence, and whether such evidence can itself be apodictic, that is, a necessary certainty rather than a contingent one. It would seem that the existence of the world would offer such, since most other forms of knowledge and even our everyday acts are predicated upon this evidence. However, Husserl argues the claim that the world exists is not apodictic, nor does it provide a kind of absolutely primary evidence. It is not apodictic because the evidence for the world's existence relies on sensuous experience, which itself is subject to the potentiality of doubt. Just as our senses can be deceived by illusions about particular things within the world, so too can the entirety of all things forming that world be an illusion. Perhaps the world I experience is but a dream, and as remote as that possibility might seem, it remains an imaginable possibility sufficient for denying its apodicity. As such, we cannot rely on our naive acceptance of the world as a basis for establishing an apodictic evidence. Instead, the world is what Husserl calls merely an acceptance phenomenon. And perhaps we can begin to discern here a divergence from Heidegger's conception of the world, which serves as a fundamental starting point for his own thoughts in regards to Dasein's always already being in a world. And we'll be returning to and deepening Husserl's conception of the world in future videos because he has a lot more to say about this. But now, let's ask, if the existence of the world cannot be certain as the absolute basis for our judgments, is there then something that precedes and is the basis for the existence of the world and that itself can be apodictic? And here we will again find Husserl following Descartes' thinking and arriving at the ego cogito, which Husserl names transcendental subjectivity, and which we will turn our attention to next time. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I would like to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. I'm recording this from a different location with family right now in Colombia in South America. Wherever I go in the world, I can't help but to do some philosophy and theory, so I'm glad to share this with you during this time. And for those who celebrate any form of the holidays, I'm wishing you a very wonderful and restful one. I'll see you all at the start of the new year, and until then, be well.